77977. Thanks for worshiping with us today.
Oh, good morning. Happy to see you all. Last week, a lot of you came, even though it snowed. Really proud of you. We were down about 20% in attendance, and the Eagles lost. Whoa, too soon, I'm guessing. I'm not saying that's causation. I'm not saying God was disappointing you for missing church, but I don't know. Down 20%, Eagles lost. In fact, they ended their season, and so I don't know how all that works. I am sorry for condolences for those of you who, which is many of you who root for the Eagles. I was rooting alongside you. What I learned a long time ago is I don't put very much of my stock, if any. I'm a college football fan, a Georgia Bulldog fan of that. I put very little stock into teenagers in tights determining my joy, and so glad that we can get past that now. But I will tell you what I was moved by, and this is in all sincerity. Seeing grown men who just lost a really big game decide to shake the other team's hand and bow on one knee in the middle of a field and thank Jesus anyway. Because one of the big misnomers, and if you're not a Christian, you get this because it bothers you so much as well, this idea that God is for some team more than any other team, and that if you pray enough, God will make your team win, right? Just not true. I was joking about the correlation piece there, and to see a bunch of men say, still about him. We still love Jesus, and we don't worship him because he tickles our, back and gives us what we want. We worship him because he's God and God alone, and so that's pretty neat to me. Now, if you're not a Christian, that's still a little weird to you, but I promise you today is the perfect day for you to be here. It won't make you do anything weird, but we are in this series, and by series, here's what I mean. We just teach through kind of this bigger idea than what 1 week can cover, and we're actually taking about 12, 13 weeks. We'll take up until the week before, a couple weeks or the month before Easter to get there. And what we're looking at is the Bible and some letters that just happen in the Bible. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, that's okay. Really good place for you to be here today. The Bible is 66 books written over about 1,600 years, and lots of authors who all kind of write one story, and the whole story is about one hero, and his name happens to be Jesus, and Jesus is our Savior, our Lord, our Messiah. That's why we sing about him. That's why we're saying we're saved in his name. And again, if you're not a Christian, that sounds really weird, and it should sound weird to you, so no judgment there. But the whole, in that Bible, 66 books, is kind of divided up into what we call two testaments, Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament all goes, we're messed up, we need a Savior, and one day God will send that Savior, and he will save the world. And all the Old Testament, lots of books, 39 of them, all point to that fact that we need help, right? They're going, our world's broken, our world's evil, no different than what we would say now. Our world is broken, it is evil, and we can't quite wrap our minds around why it's so evil. No one can. It's not just video games. It's not single parents. It's not any of those, just violence that they're exposed to from video games or TV. There is something off, and we'd all acknowledge that. And it's been that way all the time. And the whole Old Testament goes, can we acknowledge that the world is evil? Can we acknowledge that it's broken? And can we acknowledge we can't fix it? And if we can do that, if we can come to the conclusion that something needs to happen and we need to fix something that's beyond our capability of fixing, then at that point, that's where the Old Testament kind of interjects, that you will need a Messiah that's referred to as the Christ. And the whole Old Testament points to this Jesus who's going to show up. Old Testament all saying, here comes the Savior. New Testament goes, well, here he is, right? Starts Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're all biographies, legitimate biographies with footnotes and with historical evidence, with other writings like from non-Christians like Josephus and others who wrote about these stories that talk about Jesus being a true, literal human being who lived on this planet, declared he was God, was murdered for declaring that, and then ends up coming back to life, right? all that is documented throughout history. And so the New Testament begins with these 4 stories declaring Jesus' life, these biographies. And then after that, the New Testament gets pretty interesting. You get the sequel to all that happened with Jesus with his first century disciples. So the book of Acts would be kind of like the history of the church. And it talks about how the church got initiated. And then after that, it talks about these letters that were written back to Christians. So 2,000 years ago, these letters were written, and we would say 2 things about this. This is how we refer to it in the Bible. It's both timely, meaning it was very important in that moment to get these letters, and timeless, meaning 2,000 years ago, everything that was written was still very applicable and very practical to us. And if you're not a Christian, you're going to actually see that today, even if where these letters become really timeless. So we're looking at these different letters written by these first century church leaders, okay? The one we've been looking at the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to look at today, is written by a guy named Paul. Paul was a guy who hated Jesus, thought everything he said was hocus pocus, right? Didn't think any of that stuff. You can't put your stock in a human being to save you. You can't put all your hope in one person because, like we all know, that one person will fail us. And Paul thought Jesus was just selling some snake oil. To the point where this guy named Paul, whose name was originally Saul, actually did everything in his power to make sure no one believed that Jesus was who he was. To the point of killing anybody who talked about him. Then in this really weird moment in the first century, Paul's walking down the road to go persecute more people who talk about this snake oil, right? And as he's heading to a new town to thwart the plans of this hocus pocus religion, he has this really weird interaction with the God of the universe. God, Jesus, steps into the world again, post-death, post-resurrection, even post-ascension. And he comes, ascension means going back to heaven. He steps into this world and literally kind of knocks Paul down and say, you are wrong, you are messing it up, and you are persecuting me by persecuting my children. And in that moment, Paul has this about face, and the rest of his life is spent walking in this belief system. Now, it's weird for us because we haven't had that experience. So it's hard to go, well, that seems kind of weird. But for Paul, he literally had an experience none of us had, and lots of Jews after that point, and lots of other people go, well, see, if God would do that, then it would change everything. You're going to see today, well, that's not the case. But for Paul, it did change everything. And so what Paul started doing at that point was he started going from town to town, starting new little movements, that we'd call the church, and helping people understand that there was a God who loved them, that there was a God who had a plan for them, and that there was a creator who invaded this world to be in relationship with us. And so he would start these little movements, and they would get to about 50 or 60 people, and he'd move to a new town to do it. One of the places he did it was this little hipster sea town called Corinth, right? If you imagine, I don't know, something like Vegas in terms of the way that they live their lives, but on on a coastal town, somewhere like Portland maybe, or Seattle, right? You know, where you walk into one of those coffee shops and they don't have computers, they have typewriters there. They're so hip, and they're all dressed like hipsters, which leads me to my favorite definition of hipsters. It's going to offend some of you. It's not mine, it's Mark Driscoll, and he offends everybody anyway, so I'll just let him offend you here. He defines hipster as someone who dresses like their grandfather but doesn't have his work ethic, okay? There it is. Every single time. It's a shot at you millennials, almost said snowflakes, but I'm kind of in that category with you. I think it's sad, but we can all laugh, right? There you go. So Paul starts this little church in this little hipster place. They had their scarf, skinny jeans, all that kind of stuff, right? And their beards, they had fancy beards and man buns. Really, really neat little town. And this church got to 50 or 60 people, and Paul goes on. But as you can imagine, with any kind of organization, it gets infiltrated with some people with their own agenda. And so the way by which Paul kind of provides course correction to the church is by writing these letters. It was, we have TVs, we have FaceTime, we have all this new media. The only medium by which Paul could communicate them was letters. And so he would write these letters back to get the church back on the page. And this is really interesting because if you're not a Christian or don't believe in this stuff, you can at least acknowledge this. We're seeing it now with Amazon. Who knows what's going to happen next? We saw it with Walmart. You see it with all really big organizations like Alta Vista. Do y'all remember that? Lycos, right? These really fancy search engines from the 90s. And there's this thing where they are big and massive and something happens to them. And so let me kind of explain to you how that happens, and we would explain the same thing that happens with the church. And so here's how it goes. Anything starts with a movement, right? Movement. Movement's fun, right? It's where you build something out of your garage, you get really excited about it. You don't care if there's any money involved. You do it because you actually have a purpose and a cause, right? There's a movement. All organizations that exist, even Sam Walton in the beginning, wanted to be able to make it more convenient for his customers to gather more than just a few items and everything they need in one location, one store. You know, Jeff Bezos wanted you to be able to get any book you wanted, then eventually he wanted to get you anything you wanted from A to Z with that smiley face, right? And so there's this idea, and it starts with a movement. Now, the problem with anything is movements are always disorganized. So movements are usually started by people that like chaos. They move fast, they don't mind breaking things, and they start things, but they're almost always in disarray. And there's people within that movement who go, there's something off here. This movement would be more efficient. It'd be better if we bring some organization to it. So organization comes to it, and the movement moves from movement to organization. And really a close second to that organization would be this word, institution. Now we have fluorescent lights, right? Because they're more efficient. The lighting's not as good, but it costs a lot less money, right? Everything gets streamlined, everything gets going, and it goes from movement to institution. This isn't a shot at institution. It's saying most movements create so much chaos within them that someone goes, we're going to need to provide some organization to that movement. And so you get incorporation, and now you're an institute. We can look back to 1700s. People and our founding fathers go, our folks aren't educated. And not having any education is really, really bad for a society. We have lots of pioneers. We have lots of trailblazers. A lot of people can build cabins, but nobody can teach Latin or logic. And so they created these organizations, these movements to start teaching people how to learn. And then they realized the most efficient way for people to learn would be to teach them to sit still and listen to the person who is talking at them. That's what we're doing here, right? Hey, it works in a church. It must work in a school building as well. And so let's now create these higher education institutions, right? What's really interesting, if you look back, and the numbers are very high, on over 90%, probably even over 95% of all education systems started as religious education systems. They all started as a movement to help people learn. You know what they wanted them to learn? This is crazy. The Bible. You know what they wanted them to do? Be practical about implementing the scriptures. And all of a sudden, people go in and go, this is chaos. Let's create an institution that does this better, right? And then you get things like a guy who goes, I want to build a car. Oh man, there must be a better way to build a car. Then all of a sudden, this assembly line is organized, and Henry Ford doesn't create the movement of how do you make something powered on wheels. He goes, let's streamline the process, and it moves from movement to institution. That's not a bad thing, but it's just the reality of progress and how things happen. No, it's bad for some of you like me who just like chaos in every part of their life. You don't like that. I do. If I could spend all my day just breaking things, I'd be really, really happy. Wouldn't be very good for our church, but it moves from movement to institution. Now it's streamlined. That's all organizations. That's not just churches, but it happens to happen in the church too. Now, what happens here is people who implement this institution really like their ideas, they really like their policies, and they really like their way of doing things. What happens in these institutions is people then start clinging to the way that things were. Well, this is our tradition. This is what we've always done. This is how it's always worked. There's no reason, and this is the term they'll use, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There are some reasons to reinvent the wheel and put rubber on those wheels, right, Gore people? You know this, to put different things on these wheels to make them work better. And so there is some different things that people go, no, we don't reinvent the wheel. Let's just stick to what got us here. And in every progression, what happens, it goes from movement to institution to this one we don't like, but we can charge an admission for it, to museum. That's right. Let's talk about our assembly lines. Let's talk about these Model T cars, right? No one wants to drive them. Everybody wants them in their garages. The reason being is, boy, there's something nostalgic about it, but we understand that there's a better way to do things now. And so what happens when people don't move out of this institution, it goes to this museum where now all of a sudden we just talk about the past, talk about our heritage, talk about the cotton gin, talk about the phone, right? All these different things. Talk about Morse code. All these different things, and it moves to this place of museum. Now, while we'd say institution's not bad, that's just part of the making things more efficient, more streamlined. When it goes to the point where we cling to what we love, when we cling to what got us here, and it gets to the point where we're now charging admission to talk about what's happened in the past, then it is concerning. And what's interesting, this is where we'll leave it here, but if you imagine, actually I'll write it on here, it'll be fine. If you look at the modern church in Europe, right? It started as a movement. It didn't start as big chapels, right? It started as a movement. People who really believed that Jesus existed and really believed that Jesus would change the world. Then it turned into an institution, right? These big, beautiful buildings. Now, when you go to Italy, you pay money to go look inside these buildings. Now, what you're seeing in Europe, particularly in London, because they are sacrilegious in some ways, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and they don't understand modern religion, and they think it's dangerous and think it's silly and think it starts wars. You got all these different things. So what you're seeing in Europe right now, particularly in the UK, London, other places, these museums are no longer museums because they're not even interested in looking at the buildings. This actually goes one step further, and it becomes a bar, right? It goes from this movement to this organizational institution to this museum to now nobody's even interested in the museum. So we at least should charge a cover charge, play some music, and serve pints, right? All over Europe, you're seeing these beautiful church buildings. And by the way, go out to the West Coast, right? You're seeing these things that started as church buildings people going, nobody cares about church buildings, but those stained glasses are really pretty. What else can we do with these buildings? In Atlanta, there's this place called the Masquerade. It was this filthy, seedy, 5-level bar where these folks, they had to tear it down because it was in such bad shape, where these folks took over a church building to make it a multi-level nightclub and bar, because what else do you do with these buildings where people show up once a week? So in the church, you go from movement to institution to museum, and if we're not careful, to bar, right? You know what? What's interesting is this isn't just a church. It's happening all over. And we're talking about it in any organization, or even not an organization. Even let's talk about it in terms of relationships. Think about when you started dating. Your goal wasn't just to get that house built and get an open floor plan, build the pool, right? There is some movement happen here. Hopefully not too much before you got married, right? But there was some interaction with one another, and you were in love and you were smitten, right? It wasn't because you were ready to put a ring on it and just nail down all the organizational details. You didn't have the chore chart out. You weren't thinking about who was going to unload or load the dishwasher. You should have been, right? You should have been, but you weren't. It was just movement. Everything was good. Then you get married. Then you have kids. And you go, love can't fuel this. Chaos can't fuel this. You know why? Because the kids have to have their teeth brushed, and they have to go to the dentist, and you have to drop them off at school, and you have to pick them up at school, and you see all the chores that come with it. And one of you, the smarter one of the two, goes, we probably should create a calendar. We should create a chore chart. And it moves from movement where everything's laissez-faire and all lovey-dovey to, let's actually get some stuff on the list. And if you're not careful, you get so caught up in the week in, week out, running the system, right? The things that you had to put on your calendar, and you're knowing now what you have to put on the calendar, right? If you're not careful, this institution turns from all this feeling of love and excitement about the movement to, we just got to pay the bills. We just can't foreclose. Man, and what we were doing wasn't working, so let's come up with a better way to keep our house safe. And you know what? The best thing to do is treat it like a museum. Take your shoes off at the door, right? Tell the kids the things that they need to wipe the baseboards, whatever it is, because it moves from this movement of excitement to this institution. It's funny. Some of you have gotten here, and you're not sure exactly what to do. So some of you either spend more time going here, or you start hiding this stuff here back in here. Right? Oh, the first one was funny. The second one was like, oh, that's a little too close to home. Right? We see this day in and day out. This isn't what you dreamt of. And yet, this is how we end up, because it's just this weird progression. And Paul, who's smarter than us, probably the second or third. You got Jesus, you got Solomon, you got Paul. He is a brilliant man. And he loves the church so much. And he wants so desperately for it to always stay here. always stay here. That Paul spends so much time continuing to drag the church back out of this institution, this museum, to go, no, this started as a movement. What Jesus brought was a movement. We have to stay focused on the movement. So when you see all these letters that he writes and Peter writes and John writes, there really is only one agenda. It's going, hey, let's stay focused on this as a movement. This isn't a church building. That's so weird. Here we are in 2019, and we don't say, one of the things we say often is, or one of the questions we ask is, where do you go to church? Right? That it even implies that somehow in this, there's this institution that you belong to and you attend and you go to. And Paul's going, no. That church was always a movement of people. The word, it was ecclesia, which literally was a military term of a group of people called on a movement, right? And so Paul is going to continue to draw this back. Now, if you're a Christian, really, really important, because we're going to help our church stay focused here, which is the purpose of this letter they're going to read today. If you're not, you're going to realize, and all those different things, well, I just stayed at home with your marriage probably. That's good. We're all here. The reason I can talk about this is because I understand my own world, right? This isn't, I've peered into your stuff. I just know my own stuff, right? And so what you're going to realize here is that these applications, what we're going to look at, what causes this is actually really applicable to your business, to your marriage. And I just want to be really clear here. While this will be helpful for you, the real hope of today is that you will figure out that Jesus loves you and has a plan for you. But if you're not ready for that, I'm not going to manipulate you or try to persuade you. It'll still be worth your time. So that's what we're going to look at today, and we're going to figure out how does it go from here to here to here, and how do we guard against it? And what we're going to realize it has to do with one word, and it's the word vision, and it will be fun for us to work through, which leads us to the beginning of this letter that Paul writes to the hipsters at Corinth, and he writes it to them, and we're just going to read it, and we're going to begin in verse 10 of chapter 1. So Paul's written this letter. He gives us nice little salutations and greetings. I've already taken up 20 minutes on this stuff, so we're going to ignore the salutations and greetings, and we're going to get right to the meat of it. So here goes. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. And if you just look somewhere around my head, you'll get to see the scriptures. There you go. Here goes. Paul starts with this. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters. It's really important. This is an appeal. He's basically trying to change the way that they behave. He's actually, in this moment, trying to change the way people think about this process and this progression. And this isn't just for church leaders. This is all women. This is all men. This is everyone, meaning this is to every single one of us. This was both timely. The first century church in Corinth needed to understand this because they were well on their way to this progression. The 21st century church is well on the way to progression, and so it makes sense that we'd all read it. So here it goes. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. So Paul's starting very quickly and going, let me tell you whose authority I'm writing in. He's the one who stopped me on the road to Damascus and changed my world, and he's the one I continue to interact with. He's where I get this information, so I'm just going to lay it all to you. These are the words of Jesus. So Paul's going, I'm the conduit, I'm the medium, but this isn't my message. This is Jesus' message. So for the church, this is really important, not the church. You're going to go, let's see what's going on here. Let's see if Jesus knows what he's talking about. Really worth you paying attention to. So he says, here's my appeal, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. So we're going to understand this, and Paul's going, there's an issue, you're getting off task, you're moving from movement to institution, something's happening, and he's going to go, what I need you to do is I need you to be united, and here's how we make sure that happens, that there is no division among you. Now, let me just give you this example. Let's go back to the marriage before we get to the church thing, because I would go, if you want to actually know how your marriage got from here to here, it's actually really simple. Okay, this isn't Bible thing, this is people thing, and it is very elementary. Worth your time, wherever you are in marriage, or if you're going to get married, definitely worth your time. And this is where I would spend the majority of my time talking to you, which I'm not very helpful in this manner because I just want you to change your behavior if you're in a messy marriage and do something different. But if I were to talk to you, this would be what we talk about across the couch, okay? And here's what goes wrong in a marriage. You go from movement to organization here, and Paul explains it this way. He talks about the word division, okay? Now, I'm not going to talk about the etymology of it because it might be messed up, but just for memory's sake, I think this will be helpful, okay? When you see the word division, the way that I want you to see this is really helpful. Again, this isn't about etymology, where the word comes from. This is just practical, okay? I want you to see two different parts. You ready for this? You got die, and you got vision. Everybody with me there? Again, not profound. You got die, you got vision. And so here's literally how I would describe division. The vision is when there is more than one vision. Wow. Mind blown, right? Vision, division. And so literally it's going, when there was a vision for whatever it was, for your marriage, then all of a sudden you got so caught up in the mundane, control comes in, and all of a sudden you get divided. There becomes a division, and something happens where there's no longer one vision, but maybe there's two visions or three. And I would go in every single marriage, and this is going to sound really, really trite and really reductionistic. But when you and your spouse lose sight of why the two of you are actually together, this is where things get railroaded every single time. So when I talk to someone about their marriage, when I think about my own marriage, almost always, and no, I'll say always, it goes to this. It goes to, well, why are you two together? Not even how do you feel about each other in the beginning. Not even you both had puppies and rainbows. You're excited because love is not a feeling. It is a choice. And if you lean into feeling, it's going to go bad for all of us, right? But there is a moment where the two of you go, let's get married. Why was that? Well, he made me feel good. No. Let's get a bigger picture of why that was. Like, what is it about the two of you together that is distinctly better than the two of you separate? Right? When I think about that for Julie and I go, boy, man, I wish when my parents were younger, they would given us a picture of the way that things should or could be for our children, for me, that we actually can change the world. Like, there is something about the way that we were raised, how we understood the world, the emotional intelligence we could have, that there's something about our family that could actually make the world a better place. Like when Julie and I get off sorts, which happens, it happens, right? What I have to go back to is, okay, why are we together? Then I think about little Sophie. Like my daughter, she's 4, almost 5, and she's perfect. She's better than your child. She just is, right? Just is. And she's adopted. She's adopted. Like when we think about all the chaos in our world, one of the things I go back and go, why did we move from that town to start a church? Josh, you were a mess in your head. You were a mess with your emotional intelligence. There is all sorts of emotional baggage that you had in your life. And you picked up your family, moved to a new town. I'm going, well, I think God told me to. And there's all these reasons why that was not a good idea for our marriage, for our family. But every time I go back, when we got to Somerville and started that new church, as a result of that new church, we interacted with this teenager who had a friend who was a teenager. We didn't know none of them. And found out that this teenager was pregnant, did not want to abort the baby, but wanted to put the baby up for adoption. And in that moment, Julie and I both knew, okay, this is what God put us together to be a mom and dad for children who don't have a mom and dad. So we get to walk through the whole process, and every time it gets off, I go, God put us together. Put my crazy and Julie's, organization and safety, and she keeps it all right here. And every now and then I meet her here, but it's either going up or coming back down, right? And so she takes my chaos, or God takes my chaos in her order and puts them together. And in that tension, it gets the opportunity for us to love our kids and make a great life for our children and point them to Jesus every single day, right? And when I get off task, when I get unfocused, I go, no, God didn't just put us together so that we'd have a nice organized house and that I'd have a great mom for my kiddos, but the two of us together, we get to foster and adopt and give our children a picture of the way that things should or could be, right? But when we get off that task and we get focused on what makes us feel better and how our house looks and whether or not there's a mess in the house or not a mess in the house, or how we load or unload the dishwasher, or how much toothpaste we leave in the sink, which I get upset with Julie about all those things because she's a mess, Just joking, that's all me, right? So, and I get distracted about all those petty things I do because I lose sight of the actual bigger picture, which is why in the world would God put us together. So, if there's no other homework for you, if you're married, I would say the two of you, not two and your kids, not your in-laws, the two of you should sit down and actually talk about why in the world did God put you two together? Not to make you happy, not to do those things, but there is something in this. Now, if you're not married, this isn't a place to feel sadness or sorrow, or especially even if you were married and aren't anymore. I'd go, based on your current state of life, God has either created that scenario or allowed it. So you get to ask the same question Paul did, which was, why am I single? There's something for Paul about being single that allowed him the agility that wasn't available to married folks, that allowed him to lean in and chase after the gospel in a way that no one else could. So, based on your current state of life, whether that's single or married, you go, what's the vision for why God would either have paired us together or freed me from that pairing or never allowed me to have that pairing as a result of what he would want for us in a movement? So what happens is when you get off task, when you lose sight of the vision, what happens is division. And if you talk about it long enough, what you'll realize is there's still vision in there, right? For some of us, your vision is that your wife should bring you more pleasure, right? That's elementary, and that's tiny. But some of it, that's just that simple. That's just it, right? Or that your husband would provide for you financially, or vice versa, right? Or that you would share the role of the task in the house. And I'd go, that's institution. There's a much bigger picture about this above that you got to work through. And so what's going to happen here is Paul's going to go, hey, here's the issue. There's division among you, which means you have a wrong vision or a diluted vision, or at least more than one division that's happening within the church. And so what we're going to see now is Paul's going to help us understand what is the vision of the church. And so he continues, and he says this in verse 11. He goes, my brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. So he's going to point that out and go, hey, just want to point this out to you. Hey, you'll see a really neat passage here. It talks about vision. Don't have time to talk about it here. But so Paul's going to continue in chapter verse 11. He's going, hey, some of you, and let me just call out to some of you, those of you in Chloe's household, you're creating some strife and vision. You're arguing or division. You're talking about the color of the carpet, which is funny to you, right? Because if you've been a part of a church, you for a long time, you can think about those messy church splits over the decor. Or one of my favorite is when we were planning a church, we were part of Missionary Church USA, which used to be part of the Mennonite movement, okay? But back in like 1910, you're not going to believe this, some folks in the Mennonite church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, they started singing 4-part harmonies in their church services. And some of the folks in Mennonite church says, we don't sing 4-part harmony. It's a distraction. And so these people literally left the church and started a new church so that they could start singing things in 4-part harmony and in rounds, right? And they left the church and started a new denomination over this. Right? It happens all the time where there's these two different visions. No, we like the way the things are. No, we like 4-part harmony. And literally the church split. And so Paul's going, look, I just got you started. You haven't even been going for 6 months and you're already arguing, particularly those of you within Chloe's area. So let's talk about what it is. And so Paul continues in verse 12 and he says this, what I mean is this. So he's going to explain it. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. So Paul's going, hey, you've kind of picked out the leader you like best, and you're saying you're following them. Is Christ divided? This is a rhetorical question. Is he divided? Like, is he cut in parts? Was Paul crucified for you? So Paul, and talking about himself in third person, he's like, did I die for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? He goes, I thank God I did not baptize any of you. Oh, except for Crispus and Gaius. So no one can say that you are baptized in my name. So Paul's really going, I am so glad that I didn't baptize you because you're already moving this thing from movement to institution. So he's talking about these sacraments and ordinances in the church of just the way that people respond to God. And he's going, I am so glad you didn't buy into my way of doing things. And then he remembers, this is so great of Paul because, you don't have an eraser. So he's just going to keep on writing. He says, oh, come to think of it, yes, I also baptized the households of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. So this is just normal, interesting writing. Paul goes, I didn't baptize any of you. Oh, yeah, except for you two. Oh, yeah, and a few others. And so he's just explaining that. And then, so basically what he's saying here is he's going, hey, here's what I need you to understand. You guys are bought into a man's way of doing things. And so what we understand here, and this is really important, that division always happens as a result of two visions, which is a result of two visionaries. 2+, right? So if you look at a church, and you see all that happens within churches, and you see the mess, it's usually because there is a group of leaders, leading a church one way, and this new guy either the old guy goes, let's change this way, and the new guy goes, let's keep it the way, or however that works. But it always happens because there was a vision, and all of a sudden 2 different people asked 2 different groups of people to go 2 different ways. Let's go back to marriage, right? Some of you go, you know what, right now I don't have time to be your spouse. Right now I'm doing all the work I can possibly do just to raise our kids, right? So initial vision was you and I together forever, hopefully for the sake of the gospel. And then all of a sudden these kids come in and one person goes, hey, we can't focus on that anymore. We got to get the kids out of the house. And the other one goes, hey, I understand this was you and I together forever, but right now I don't have time to date you, to spend time with you, to engage with you, because right now we got to get that addition built to the house, right? My job is so busy right now that I got to focus on the job. And they're going, wait, I thought it was you and me together forever. And they'll go, well, if we can't even be together forever if I can't pay the mortgage, right? And I can't pay the mortgage if I don't go to work. And so all of a sudden, this big, beautiful picture of the way that things should or could be, right? Some of you got to get back to that you were called to foster or to adopt or whatever that thing was, right? To start that organization, to do that thing, to go overseas with your spouse to serve in whatever capacity it was, right? Whatever that is, that's why you got together. And all of a sudden, these folks come in and go, oh, nope, that's no longer our vision. And there is a new vision, right? And so what Paul is saying here is going, look, here's the deal. You have lost sight of who the visionary is. That's Jesus. And you've now thought Paul was better, or Cephas was better, or Apollos was better. And you have leaned in to a new vision. So I just asked this in your marriage. Okay, who's in charge? And who has the most to gain from being in charge? Who benefits if you go on this new plan? Right? And even you ask that within the church. I think this is really important. You go, okay, who's the visionary? Okay, what are they saying you should do? And who gains from you doing that? If the one at the top tends to gain the most, I would be really, really, really suspicious of that. If the visionary is the one who benefits the most from the vision, then I would be really, really skeptical of that vision. In fact, here's what I would say. Here's a better question to ask. Who has the most to lose? If the visionary now is the one with the most to lose, probably a better person to follow, right? And so when you look at a marriage, you go, okay, why in the world are you just talking about how much pleasure you get? Is that really what our marriage has been reduced to? Okay, who has the most to benefit? Who has the most to lose? If one person's going, follow me, you should trust me because it's all about this is what we should do, then I would just go, if the visionary, the one declaring these new truths, the way that we should spend our money or take up taxes, if they have the most to gain, then I would just be really, really cautious with them. If within a church movement, if there's a leader who comes in and says, this is what we should do, if they have the most to gain, it's really dangerous to follow them. So what Paul's going to do here is he's going to point back not to Apollos, not to Cephas, not to himself and go, those people we should follow. He's going to give us a better picture of who to follow. And let me just go ahead and tell you up front. It's the person who really does have the most to lose. Okay? And we'll continue. And he goes, verse 17. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. So he's going, let me draw you back to who the real visionary is. Let me draw you back to the one who's really in charge. And Paul's going to point back to the one who started the whole movement, Jesus. And he goes, the minute these new people come in and add to this vision, say you got to sit in a certain color chair or pew, or that you have to sing certain songs, or you can't put screens up, or you got to get rid of the hymnals, or you got to have the hymnals, or you got to do all these things, right? All these, these tactical ways to do church. Got to have this kind of building. Don't want that kind of building. Shouldn't have a building at all, whatever it is. When these people do that, what he's saying is that all of a sudden you're getting focused on a strategy of the church, not the vision of the church. And Paul goes, let me be clear here. There is only one visionary, and his name is Jesus. And this is why I would just say this to you over and over again. Look, we have transitioned over the last 20 months from Pastor Jeff leading this church for 30 years to what looks like me leading this church for 30 years, or the next 30 years, I certainly hope. But what's really happened is we just have someone else sitting still with the real senior pastor and going, here's where we're going to go. So we haven't changed senior pastors. We haven't changed a new lead guy. What we've changed is some of the lieutenants and generals and how that works, because there's only ever been one senior pastor of this church. And his name is Jesus. And so what Paul's saying here is, look, division happens when someone else tries to take an authority that doesn't belong to them and doesn't give it back to the person who's in charge. So I'd go, here's the question is, who's in charge? And I'd go, hopefully the one with the most to lose. And who's the one the most to lose? The one who actually got murdered on a cross for it. Right? And so you got that piece of going, who's the visionary? And then what orders are the people within the church following? And I'd go, here's the two things. And if you don't like this church, I just would offer this to you. Please go somewhere where they open up God's word every single week. They read from it. Read from it. Not just, give you some ideas about it. They read from it. And at the end of every single story, they remind you who the hero of the story is. That's Jesus, right? And so every single week, if you're part of this thing, we're going to read this thing, and we're going to talk a lot about Jesus. And so he goes, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." So he's going, the minute we make this about anybody other than Christ, the minute we make it about the clothes you wear, the minute we make it about how much money you give, or any of those things, right? The minute we make it about your church attendance, what we're actually saying is what Christ did doesn't really matter that much. The minute we make it about anything else over the fact that your sin was paid for by Jesus on the cross, the minute we make it about anything else, what you're actually doing is you're making what Jesus did for you worth less. And here's really interesting, and this is why pluralism gets really confusing when we start having conversations. You see it in the church because, boy, you don't want to be offensive. And so you go, when people talk about, you tell me Jesus is the only way to God? Like, you go, there's many ways to Jesus. Maybe you found him in a bar. Maybe you found him because you thought your plane was going down and you cried out to him. Maybe you found him in a church. There are many ways to Jesus, but there is only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. You go, that is so arrogant and dogmatic and closed-minded. Okay. Here's what we know about the history of who Jesus is. We got 4 biographies about him that I would say are, there's more evidence to those biographies than any other biography ever written, right? We have hundreds of manuscripts. There are footnotes within it. There are eyewitness accounts. We have manuscripts from 100 years after Jesus' life. I mean, this is just profound, right? And so these biographies, they all capture something really unique. And one of the things they all capture is Jesus, on the night he's about to get arrested, he goes into this garden. Right? You know the story, even if you're not part of church, you know that Jesus gets crucified on the cross. He has this really unique interaction with the God of the universe. You know what he says to the God of the universe? In that moment, he goes, "Dad, I get your vision. And your vision is that these people cannot pay the price for their sin. These people cannot fix themselves." And we don't have to go far to believe that, right? The more you try to fix yourself, the more you become aware of that you can't. We are less than 3 weeks into the new year, and your New Year's resolutions are already in the tank, right? They're already in the trash because the very things that we set out to do, we are not very good to do. And so in this interaction, God goes to Jesus. Jesus goes to God and goes, "Hey, I understand that the wages of sin, the punishment for any kind of behavior that's outside of yours is death. And I understand that you, in your loving mercy, have decided to punish me as a surrogate for all the people in the universe." And he says something to them, right? And he goes, "Dad, I don't really want to do it. I don't really want to take this pain." Right? And if we believe anything about God being loving and gracious, and he's got to be to even let us be on this planet, right? The same way you created life with your children, God allowed us and created us to be in there. And in that moment, we know that Jesus asks for permission to not have to go through with it. And we also know in human history, he goes through with it, right? That's what history captures. And you go, if God is loving and he literally murders his own son, if there were any other way, even if it were hard, even if it were very complicated, even if it meant a life filled with devotion, if there was any other way he could reconcile himself to his children, if there were any other way, don't you think he'd do it? And he didn't. We see Jesus ask for permission not to do this because of the gravity and the weight of what he's going to feel. And we see through human history in the Bible that Jesus gets crucified on the cross. In other words, why would God do that to his child if there was any other way? And yet he doesn't. Which implies that there must not be any other way. So it's not that I'm trying to be dogmatic and closed-minded. It's going, there's no way I can reconcile a really, really loving God and the murder of his son unless that was necessary in this deal. And so what Paul's saying is, look, we can't talk about all these other things. Let's not get distracted about how big the steeple should be. Let's not get distracted on all the semantics of kind of the order of service in church. What we need to stay focused on is that Jesus literally died, guys. Like, he paid the price for all this and makes it available to you. And when we talk about anything else, either it's a distraction or worse, it actually limits the power of the cross because you're now adding to what's necessary for people to be reconciled with God. You're now saying they should tuck their shirt in because if they don't, God's not happy with them anymore. Do you not understand that the reason God is happy with people is not because of their own behavior, but because of what Jesus did? So to tell them they got to part their hair or sing certain songs or drink certain drinks or do communion a certain amount of times for God to be okay with them, do you understand when you're telling them that those behaviors make God okay with them, what you're actually saying is what Jesus did for them wasn't enough. which is really important because we do it ourselves. We actually beat ourselves up, right? Remember when we talked about that bar thing for a second? And you felt all sorts of shame. And your spouse was happy you felt that shame, right? Because we're hoping that does some behavior modification. But here's the reality of the deal. You have to stop beating yourself up over your behavior, because guess who was already beat up for your behavior? The one who had everything to lose. And so what Paul's saying here is we gotta take all the behavior stuff out of it. We gotta take all the control out of it, and we gotta point it all back to Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who does all the work. And he continues, and he says this: for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us that are being saved is the power of God. So Paul just kind of calls out the awkward elephant in the room, and he goes, yeah, some of you think this is nuts. You're telling me the God of the universe literally showed up on this planet and died. I don't get it. It's nuts. It's even more nuts 2,000 years ago not knowing the story at all. So people are starting to hear the story, and they're going, wait, let me get this right. Do you understand we have kings, we have pharaohs, we have Caesars, we have all sorts of stuff. Those visionaries, they're not going to die for the minions. Like, this is so counterintuitive, and it makes no sense in light of the world that we live in. And he's going, no, that doesn't make any sense. So you're going, hey, does that make sense to you? And what's really nice here is Paul kind of gives preachers, including himself, permission not to try to convince you of it. He's going, yeah, there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to convince you, and yet I still want to. I want to just point out some things, right? Even though it's almost not necessary. I'd go, think about when you're really, really angry. Like when you're really, really angry at someone and you want them to reap the consequences of their behavior. You're really angry, right? And think about this time. It happens very rarely. When they walk to you in absolute humility and just apologize for their behavior, what does that do to you in that moment? You still want to be angry, but there is something that changes for you in that moment where you wanted all this pain for them, and all of a sudden they literally come to you and go, it's me, it's my fault. Like something happens in that moment that when humility really happens, you go, of course, yeah, it's okay. Like it almost makes you uncomfortable. You don't even know how to respond to the apology. You go, oh, it's okay, not a big deal. And you go, no, it's still a big deal, right? There's just something about those moments that seem really counterintuitive, that are more meaningful to us than any kind of punishment they would have received. You got them in your mind, right? So what Paul's saying is, look, yeah, it doesn't make sense, but when those moments happen, think about the greatest person when they got on their hands and feet and served you to the point where you felt uncomfortable. You're going, oh, that's really weird, but man, what a great person, right? And so even though we go, it's all counterintuitive, the God of the universe, he wouldn't die. It's going, those moments that really move us in life are filled with absolute humility and absolute service. Now imagine you knew a guy who was perfect, who really never made a flaw. And then imagine them serving you. And then imagine them paying the price for you. Paul's going, that's actually what happens. And our minds can't quite get it. So it's just weird. It doesn't even make sense that the God of the universe would do this. And Paul goes, yeah, for some of you, it just doesn't land. It makes no sense. Because it's foolishness. But he continues and he goes, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? He goes, here's the thing you got to understand. Where's the people that are explaining all this to you? The smartest people in the world. Deepak Chopra, you got one of the Dawkins or Hawkins, all these guys. What are they explaining to you? They're just explaining to you maybe some weird stuff of how we got here, and then they just talk too smart and too fancy that I go, oh, they're smarter than me. They just must know what they're talking about. Right? And they're going, but if you really sit and listen, does it really sound that smart? Or does it just sound like gibberish? Right? He's going, and even those things, they may explain to you how this all happened. But have you ever heard a wise person really talk about why you're here? These great scientists, have you heard any of them explain why you're here? They're going, you a bag of chemicals, you kind of showed up, right? How about this? Has any really brilliant guy told you where the sun came from? They told you what it is, and it's a possibility. But who in the world sustains it? And will it ever run out of energy? Is it just a ball of gases way out there in the universe somewhere? Where does that come from? He's going, so all these really wise people, they don't even have good answers for all this wise stuff they're talking about. He's going, because none of it makes sense outside the picture of there being a creator who created us. And if that creator created us, we got to understand why. And the best possible explanation is because he wants to be in relationship with us. And the reason we're not is because we can't fix ourselves. So the best possible solution is that there is actually a God who loves us and died died for us. And Paul's going, yep, but some of you are going to go, no, I just can't get it. So he continues, he goes, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. I love this. He goes, look, we don't really have a good way to get this out of these words and into your brains. So God goes, we chose a really, really awkward way. We decide we just let someone stand up, read from God's word, and declare it as true. And we'll just see how that lands. He's going, look, there's no explanation that could possibly explain logically why a creator wanted to be with you, but he does. Why he was willing to die for you, but he did. Look, it is foolishness. It does not make sense. This is not the kind of story you write. You read the story of a hero who conquers, or not a hero who dies on a cross, and while he's dying, in what his meekness goes, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Like, this doesn't even make sense. So the best solution is not heart surgery. The best solution is not beating someone over the head, right? The best solution isn't to force this on someone. He's going, the best solution, Paul goes, is, look, we're just going to continue to declare it over and over again and beg the Lord to do something. And here's what's really neat for those of you who don't believe. I don't feel this pressure to convince you because I actually think God's real. And the way that he interacted with Paul on this road and transformed his life, I actually think he wants to do with you. And it doesn't start with you. It starts with him. So one of these days, you keep coming, we're going to keep preaching, and what's going to happen, and it's not going to make a lot of sense, is all of a sudden it's just going to click. Not because your mind was open to the brilliance of it, but because you're going to come to some conclusions that you can't fix yourself, and you're going to go, if there's any possible solution for that. And in that moment, God's going to go, I've always been the solution for that. So Paul goes, it's not all the wisdom, it's not the whiteboard. Literally, it's just preaching. It's just preaching. For an hour is what he says, or more, every single week. And then Paul goes on in verse 22, he goes, Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. So look, some of you want some miraculous sign. You're going, if you light that guy on fire right now, if he just spontaneously combusts, I'll believe, right? If you'll give me a burning bush, whatever it is. So he's going, look, the Jews have always looked for more signs. And he goes, the Greeks have always looked for more academia. They've always wanted to give you some more logic for it. He's going, how about photosynthesis? That is both some really logical and some really supernatural things. You mean every time you breathe, you spit out carbon dioxide because it's wasteful, but God is such a perfect steward. He takes that carbon dioxide and he feeds plants with it. And then he's so gracious, he not only feeds the plants with it, it spits out oxygen, you breathe it. Oh, that makes sense, right? And so you're going, well, science explains it, so it makes sense to me now. And you go, no, it doesn't make sense. All scientists do there is they're just explaining to you God and his doctrine of stewardship. That's all that's happening there, right? So even science, all they're really doing, that's why we're not afraid of science, all they're doing is they're proving the point that there's never enough. Greeks, there's never enough information that's going to finally convince you. How did the sun get where it is? Every single morning there's a sunrise. By the way, the Bible says every single time you see one of those, there's new mercies available to you. Where does that come from? Well, science can explain a part of how God works, but it's never going to be enough. And no matter how many signs you need, listen, right now, 2019, on January 20th, there's some stranger on stage who's literally telling you, God loves you. This whole church was built 292 years ago for one reason, for a stranger to you on this stage today to declare that God loves you, did all the work. You have to do nothing. You are completely forgiven, and he loves you. Like, how does all that work? Right now, you showed up here. You weren't planning to show up here. You didn't know this guy was going to talk about this. Today, this is miraculous. Some stranger on stage is declaring that you are loved, and there is nothing you could ever do, no matter how hard you try, to make God love you anymore. And there's nothing you could ever do to make God love you any less. You are just loved, and Jesus died for you, and he just wants you to trust that. Like, that's just for you. That's just for you. How much more miracle do you need than today in that moment? And Paul's going, here's the problem. If you want more miracles, you want more academia, none of that's going to be enough. But we preach one thing, Christ crucified. It's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's foolishness to the Gentiles. That Christ died for you. He died for you. Like, he loved you so much, he died for you. And while he was dying for you, he was so enamored by you that he said, oh, God, you got to forgive them for every single behavior they did. You got to forgive them for the mess in their marriage. You got to forgive them for the way they love their kids. You just got to forgive them. And here's what he says, because they don't really know what they're doing. They're just following all the other rules, which is eat, drink, and be merry. Right? That's the best thing a philosopher can tell you. Eat, drink, and be merry. And I just go, how's that working for your waistline? How's that working for your liver? How's that working for your marriage? How's that working for the very thing you want, which is a family that you love and that loves you? So these deep, crazy philosophies, can't we just acknowledge they're not working for us? And so he's going, yeah, I can explain all that, but the reality is there is only one thing, and that's Christ crucified. The God of the universe died so you didn't have to. And either you can go, yep, I believe it, or I don't. That's the only vision, which leads me to this. But those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So he's going, for those who finally get it, when they get that, everything changes. The way they interact with other people changes. And here's what they get. They get both the power of God, like they can love and be gracious unlike anyone else, because that's infused in them by the God of the universe, and they get wisdom. And all of a sudden, when they see a sunrise, they go, God's showing off. He just wants me to know that he's loved, that I'm loved, and that he's there. When they look at the depths of the universe, they don't go, there must be aliens everywhere. They go, our God is that big that he spoke infinite universes into creation to show us that he can be trustworthy. The same way he said to Abraham, look at the stars in the sky. That's how good my promise are you. That's how many offspring you have. That and everything, something changes, and they see God at work in all that. And so we go, okay, what does that mean for us? It means this. It means Paul is saying, don't get distracted. Don't get caught up in the silly things. Don't try to convince everybody and get on these persuasive arguments. Love Jesus. Declare that he was crucified for you and for all people, and that's the goal of the church. You know, I really struggled with this growing up because I grew up in a fundamental world that wanted to fix people. And deep down, I had this really big problem because I knew that I wasn't capable of fixing myself, so how could I fix other people? So I knew that, but then I became a pastor, and to be honest with you, it was this huge insecurity that every week I thought I was supposed to stand up and convince people they should be saved and tell, all sorts of emotional jokes and all sorts of stuff that makes you just feel the weight of all this, or emotional stories and jokes. And then at the end, I was supposed to get you to pray a prayer, and I knew I was successful because you'd raise your hand, or you'd come down front, whatever it was, right? So week in and week out, it was like, I got to get these souls into eternity. I felt this weird pressure. And I felt so manipulative, right? I felt like I was just scaring people every week, convincing all of them that when they got in their car, they were going to die in a car wreck. So they better pray some prayer. I literally felt this weight and going, but God, I can't save people. But according to the scriptures, Paul doesn't want me to save people. In fact, I can't. And so where I ended up, really crazy story over multiple nights, and I'll tell you some other day, where I ended up in these scriptures that God just gave me a very clear picture to what I think is the picture of the church and how we operate. And so after waking up multiple nights, I ended up in this passage of scripture in Luke chapter 3, verse 6. That says, all mankind will know God's salvation. And I remember going, that's all I want, God. I just want everybody to know God's salvation. How does that happen? How does that happen for every single person in this room today? And God actually gives us something really prescriptive. He takes this guy named Isaiah, and he quotes this passage, declaring it for God, and then he has it, declares it for John the Baptist. And in Luke chapter 3, he gives us a picture of how all this works. And I go, this is our vision. This is how church works for us. And here's what it says. As it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the wilderness. And this is what he says, prepare the way of the Lord. Continue for me there, Rich. Make straight paths for him. Every valley shall be filled in, every mountain and hill made low. The crooked road shall become straight, the rough road smooth. And all people will seek God's salvation. And I remember reading that and going, oh, that's so nice, because, God, can't fix people. I can't save people. The only thing you're telling me to do is prepare a way for them to see God. It actually gives us some ideas. It says, hey, if there's a mountain in the way, cut it down. If there's a valley in the way, fill it up. If it's a crooked path, then make it straight. In other words, we can't save people. We can't fix people. You know what we can do? We can make it simple for them to see Jesus. So as a church, the only thing, we have one vision because Jesus is our hero, Jesus is our leader, and it's this. We are just day in and day out just going to continue to remove obstacles. Like you are here today, and there is air or heat on, and there are lights in this building, and there's screens with these words on it. Not because we want to impress you. We're not that good. But because we want to remove every possible obstacle that we can so that you can see Jesus. The reason we're starting a counseling center, not because we want to impress people, because some of the obstacles are in our marriages and in our families, and we need real legitimate help before we even consider Jesus. So we're going, what are those obstacles? Let's get those obstacles out of the way so that people can see Jesus. And so, if you hear anything else from here about us being clever, about new TVs, about new screens, about new signs, if the goal of it is not to remove obstacles so that people can see Jesus, like right now online, people can see these scriptures behind us. Right in our viewing room, people can see this stuff. If it's not for that end, then please stop following. And raise your hand and declare, we have lost sight and we are becoming an institution and we are not far from becoming a museum. Because we have one goal, always will be that. We're going to continue to remove obstacles so that people can see Jesus. And every single week, we're just going to lift Jesus up and declare him as the Lord of all things. And so what's going to happen here is the band's going to come up. And what you don't know here is a lot of times you get to sing. As we sing and we celebrate it. There's this really unique passage where Jesus says this. He says, When the Son of Man is lifted up, he draws people to himself. Now, in that moment, what he's talking about in the Gospels is he's saying, there's going to come a day I'm going to be raised back to my Father in heaven. And when that happens, I'm going to take people with me. But I think there's another piece of that going. When we declare Jesus as Lord, when we worship him, then he comes in and he starts drawing people to himself. And so for 2019, I want you to see this. As we stand in awe of who God is, something unique's happening. You are worshiping Jesus, and as you're worshiping Jesus, other people are being compelled with the idea that maybe this God is real, and maybe he's loving. And so as we sing, may we sing to celebrate who Jesus is in our life, but we also lift him up in the hopes that he would draw people to himself. And so we're going to practice that in 2019.